Good evening and welcome to our in-person audience and to our online audience. This evening's discussion panel is on the topic of good grief. How can we support bereaved people better? My name's Laura Davies. I'm a researcher here at the Faculty of English, and I work on a project called A Good Death, which aims to open up questions around death and dying and improve vocabularies on those topics. And I'm so pleased to be able to chair this brilliant panel this evening. I'm conscious that when we advertised this panel, we had COVID in mind. Now, of course, we have the war in Ukraine, and I'm thinking that some of the things that we're talking about today take on a new resonance. And so I just wanted to mention that we've got it in our minds as we move forward. Before I introduce the speakers, let me just cover a few practical points. This is absolutely a discussion panel, so of course our speakers will be giving short presentations, but we'd love also to hear from you, whether that be personal or professional insights, questions or reflections. So the structure of the event will be that I'll ask each of our speakers to talk for about 10 minutes. And if you have a brief question or you need something clarifying, just raise your hand and we can address those to the individual speaker. But after all three speakers have given their presentations, there'll be lots of time at the end for questions and conversation. If you're online, please convey your questions to us digitally, and we will speak to those in the room if we can. Just one point. As I say, we really welcome your discussions, but we are recording this panel session. So just be aware that if you don't wish to be recorded, you might want to just have a think about whether or not you ask a question. You're welcome to come and speak to us afterwards briefly if you'd like to talk in person. Okay, so let me talk to you briefly about each of our speakers. We'll begin with Professor Stephen Barclay. He works clinically in general practice and as a hospice honorary consultant. He is Associate Professor at Cambridge and Honorary Professor at the University of East Anglia. He leads the Cambridge Palliative and End-of-Life Care Group and the teaching of palliative care in the University of Cambridge School of Clinical Medicine. He's clinical lead for palliative and end-of-life care at the Cambridge and Peterborough Integrated Care System, and also clinical lead for the NHS East of England Strategic Clinical Network. So he is really well placed to begin our conversation, which is going to be thinking about research into grief and bereavement. Our second speaker is Amber Jeffrey. She created the Grief Gang Instagram page and podcast 3 years ago after her mother's untimely death from a heart attack in 2016, when Amber was only 19. She went in search of a place, a voice that resonated with how she felt and where she felt she could be seen in her grief. But she didn't have any luck with that quest, and so she decided that if she couldn't find it, she would become that voice. The strapline of Amber's podcast is, "Welcome to the gang, the one you never asked to be a part of." And our third speaker is Dr. Dan Knights. He's a former Cambridge medical student and now a GP registrar in London, a hospice specialty doctor in Peterborough, and he's recently returned to the university as an Adam Brooks Charitable Trust Clinical Research Fellow with the Cambridge Palliative and End-of-Life Care Group. He's going to be speaking to us today about his research into the role of non-professionals and peers in bereavement support and how these initiatives link with primary care. So I know that's a lot to take in, but as you can see, we've got three really brilliant perspectives today, and I hope that we can see some threads and make connections between their presentations. So let me begin then by asking Stephen to speak with us first.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I guess before I start, I just want to acknowledge that probably all of us are here. And I know for myself, it was the death of my mother when I was 7 that fundamentally shaped not only the person that I am, but the work that I do. And I just want to have that acknowledged at the start. The hardest patient for me personally that I've ever looked after was this man's son. Alan Hargrave was actually, he's now moved on to a new role, was vicar of Holy Cross Church in Cambridge. And I had the sad privilege of looking after his 21-year-old son as he died at home with advanced cancer. And sometime after Tom died, Alan had a sabbatical. He was then working at the cathedral in Ely to write a book about Tom. And during that time, he rapidly realized it wasn't a book about Tom, but it was a book about himself and how he had struggled profoundly with the pain of losing a young adult son. And if you want a book that speaks at one level, it's a very easy read. At another level, it's an immensely tough read. But Alan describes in brutal northern plain speak his experience. And I love the phrase where he says, grief is shit, and there's no other way to describe it. So I commend that book to you. It's very accessible, and I believe it's still in print. So we teach the medical students about bereavement care. They find it one of the most frightening half days of their clinical course, because when you're 22 and probably have had a very successful life, and the worst disaster you've had is you failed your grade 3 piano exam a few years ago, actually to be confronted by the raw pain of bereavement is not easy. But they need to be prepared, because as junior doctors and as senior doctors, they will be meeting and caring for bereaved people. So just by way of perhaps a little bit of framing, we give them a couple of theoretical models. And these are models, these are people's ways of trying to understand in some way the experience of bereavement. They are not truth, but they are based on a lot of research. And the Denver Grief Institute talks of the grief wheel, where people are going along in life and then they experience a loss. We're thinking, I guess, particularly today of bereavement by the loss of a loved one, but there are multiple other forms of bereavement. And people go through shock and protest, and then often spend a great deal of time at the bottom of that wheel in disorganization, because the world has collapsed around us and we can't make sense of the world. But if people are supported to grieve, for many people there will be some form of reorganization. And if you notice, after that wheel, and it's an iterative, it goes to and fro and to and fro, the arrow is deliberately slightly above the horizontal, because it is possible to come out of an experience of bereavement, or to live with an experience of bereavement, with a new sense of values and a new perspective on the world. That's one model which we use with the medical students. The other one we use is the dual process model developed by Strober and Shute, that talks of two things going on simultaneously often in bereavement. Some are loss-orientated and some are restoration-orientated. And people oscillate, and sometimes in a pair, say a young couple who've lost a young child, one of the parents can be on one side of that diagram and the other can be on the other. And unless they understand that they are both grieving, but grieving profoundly differently, then the experience of the loss of a loved one can end up in the destruction of the relationship as well. People grieve very differently. And I love this quote. I was given this by one of our students, that if a person doesn't die of a wound, then it heals in some fashion, and so it is with loss. From the sharp pain of immediate bereavement, we passed into the grey days of numb bewilderment and waiting. So grief has always seemed to me a time of not waiting for the hurt to pass, but of becoming accustomed to it. The pain never goes away, does it? And the other thing we say with our students, and the percentages can differ slightly, is the research is clear that not everybody who has a profound personal bereavement needs counselling. And there's a reflex reaction, isn't there, that when something difficult happens, let's get counselling. No. In the early days, counselling is perhaps, for many people, really helpful. And indeed, the great majority of people seem to work through and get through grief with that informal support network that is so important. The problem with the pandemic is, how do you grieve when you're self-isolating? And you couldn't. And that's one of the reasons that we're finding so many clinical problems now. But pre-pandemic, about 10% perhaps need extra counselling and support, and something like 5%, a small minority, needs specialist psychological or indeed even psychiatric support. So just very briefly, I'm just going to talk you through one of our research studies that we undertook in the height of the first wave of the pandemic. I pivoted our research group to a number of studies during 2020. And it became immediately apparent that bereavement and loss was a huge agenda. So we undertook a study. If you wanted to read it, it's there. It's open access in BMJ Open. And we undertook a national survey of professionals who were involved in some way in supporting bereaved people. So these were not bereaved people themselves. So these were doctors and nurses and counsellors and chaplains and funeral directors and funeral celebrants, etc., etc., etc. And we got over 800 responses from right across the United Kingdom. And just a few quotations, and then I'm going to finish. So these are professionals. I wanted to be with people at their time of greatest need, and I couldn't. My whole reason for being seemed taken away, and I was sad and angry and upset, and I still am sometimes. It's so much harder to support people by telephone. You can't sit with people in their grief. One of the things I say to our medical students is the skill of supporting someone who's experiencing bereavement is to open your ears and shut your mouth. They don't know what to say. The answer is there isn't anything you can say, but active, supportive listening. And students find that difficult, but I believe that to be the case. And I'm conscious of time. And I think there was a stigma, and there remains a stigma around COVID being on a death certificate. And that tsunami of grief from the pandemic is here. And I'm going to think I finish at that point.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. Does anyone in the audience have just a brief question, perhaps a matter of fact or detail that you'd like to direct to Stephen? It's not compulsory, and someone can bring you a microphone. Okay, so please think up some questions for the discussion at the end. So let me now hand over to Amber. She's going to speak to us about her lived experience. I'm thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Amber Jeffrey. I have no slides. I'm not a slide type of girl. To touch on, I suppose, by way of introduction first, I'm not an academic, I'm not a doctor, and before I probably would used to say that I didn't feel like I was eligible or worthy to be in spaces to speak on such matters, on how do we support bereaved people better. But as I will go into with the work that I have done over the last few years, I believe that, yes, I am an experienced expert, as I like to say now, and that my voice and the voice of those who are bereaved is very much at the centre. So I guess I should tell you as to how I am even here in this panel with such wonderful people. I lost my mum, Sue, back in 2016 to a very sudden heart attack, myself being 19 at the time, her being 51. It was very unexpected. She was quite fit and healthy. Heart attack one day, died the next morning. And with that, myself being 19 and my brother at the time being 26, turning 27, we were catapulted into this life of grief. And I was left about to go into my 20s as a woman without her mother. For that first year, it's still very much a blur. And I think for many who have been bereaved, you may feel that as well, very much of a blackout. Even now, as I do a lot of inner work, there's still very blurry things there. And that is with the trauma. And there's very much trauma is very much intertwined with grief. I think no matter how your person died, you may diminish it. That's a whole other conversation. We'll go into trauma. That's very deep-rooted. But I very much suppressed my grief. And I wasn't one of those 5% who kind of went to counselling straight away. Mine took me 3 years. And I've come to realise, as I've spoken with my community, there's something about that third year that makes people go, something's not right here. And for me, that was. And to be very brutally honest, I hit that third year of my mum's anniversary, and I wanted to die. Very plain and simple. I had a very dramatic shift in myself. I'd like to say myself was a bit of a happy-go-lucky type of girl. And during this summer, I wasn't. I thought, what's going on here? I don't feel right. And some very intrusive thoughts and some very worrying thoughts begin to enter my mind. And that's when I realised something's got to give. And so I did, as what kind of Stephen touched on, that we're kind of conditioned, I'll loosely say, to do, is to call it the therapist, call it the counsellor. And so I did. Well, I decided to go through my NHS first, my GP, and the waiting list just was unfortunately too long. I was quite scared of what my mind was doing. I couldn't actually physically wait the length of period that they were giving me. I looked at going private, but I'm not a millionaire. And I thought, right, let's go online. Let's see what online therapy looks like. And I was set up with an online therapist. I speak about this very in detail with a bit more expletives on my podcast. I'll save for Cambridge. And I went, how can I help you today, Amber? What do you need help with? And I was like, blimey, you got all day. Like, okay. So I said, yeah, my mum's died. I feel really a bit off. I don't feel right. I feel suicidal, essentially. She said, okay, write back to me and tell me kind of some things you're expecting from therapy. I said, I don't know, I've never done this before. So I just said, I just don't want to feel like I want to die anymore. Very plain and simple. And I got a very quite generic answer back of, if you'd like to continue, that will be, it was like £200 up front or £50 a month. Very transactional. And that was when I decided, I've got to go this alone. Which now I don't realise you have to go it alone, but in that moment I felt that I had reached out, took that leap of faith to finally get support, being the prideful soul that I am. And I kind of felt like I fell flat on my arse. And so I kind of started the self-soothing, and even me kind of saying out loud eventually that I need help was almost enough for me. But I knew it wasn't enough. I needed to connect with people. I needed to speak with people who got it. My peer group at the time, there was no one kind of in my close vicinity who had lost not only a parent or even just a large significant loss. I felt very alienated in my support groups. None the wise as well, I had lost quite a few friends as well during my process. I very much went for nearly about 2 years without a really solid friendship group. And that was really hard as a young woman who had gone from quite a vibrant friendship group to kind of going it alone. And so I went on this quest, as we said in the introduction, my quest, to find people who just get it. And maybe some people in the room, you love a podcast like me. And I started throwing in grief into Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And I found a good handful of podcasts on there, and I started listening, and I was like, right, okay, there's a community here. But there wasn't just something that I felt was really speaking to me and to my story. There wasn't a young, now 20-something-year-old woman or just person speaking about what it's really like to lose a significant role in your life and to go through those everyday peaks and troughs. I was going to say something a bit more expletive there, peaks and troughs of being a young adult. And so I went on this god-awful holiday to Morocco with my partner, and something just clicked to me, and I just said, I've got to do it. I've got to do it myself. I need to go on a quest and find these people myself. And so I did. I started the Grief Gang Instagram page, and then with that, I introduced the idea of starting a podcast. I had no structure into how I was going to do this podcast. I just went, I've got so much up here that I need to get it out. And if nobody else listens to it, that's absolutely fine with me. I have just brain dumped. And as I brain dumped, they started to come in the hundreds, and then the thousands, and then the tens of thousands. And we're now at a point now where the Grief Gang community is nearly at 30,000 people. That's nearly 30,000 people who are actively looking to understand their grief and the language around their grief and how to express it, and to not only find people who get them as well. But to go back to when I first started the Grief Gang, I not only understood that I needed to tell my story, I needed to empower other people to tell their stories as well. And storytelling, I think, is a huge part in healing of grief. Like Stephen said, the power of just being heard. Sometimes we don't need an answer, we don't need a fix, we don't need the monumentous, one-liner that we get. You just want to be seen and heard in your entirety in your grief. And so with that, I went on the hunt to find guests from all over the country, from all different types of losses, be it parental, sibling, child and baby, whatever it may be, to find their stories and to share them on the wider scale. And with that, it has brought myself learnings that I could never have imagined, and it has connected people and made people feel less alone. So that was 2019 I started, that September 2019, up until about March 2020, and then we hit a pandemic. I've gone from going in person and meeting people in rooms like this, and meeting people in person and sitting down, crying, laughing, sharing our stories on grief, to everything now going online. And for me, that was a huge change as well, and how I connected with my audience and provided them support. But what drastically changed in that time was the conversations that I was having with my community. Now, as I said earlier, I'm not an academic or a professor or anything like that, but there have been some very intense conversations in very small pockets of the internet where these people significantly need help, and they're turning towards their communities. As this conversation changed, I began to notice that my story and those who, I guess, who have been bereaved previously to the pandemic, and those who are now being bereaved and still continuously are on a whole different caliber of grief. We were stripped, and they were stripped of so many of society's basic norms when it comes to grieving and how you grieve. If any of you here in the room today have lost somebody during these last 2 years, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You will have lost somebody, and you might not have been able to be there to hold their hand, to say goodbye, to bury them, to not have the comfort of going to your friend's house, have a cry on their shoulder. Those basic necessities when somebody dies are so vital. So what happens when you don't have them? You're isolated. And we're now beginning to see very studies and articles coming out about prolonged grief. And I'm a bit on the fence about it and how it's kind of being treated, because it's kind of, well, yeah, there is going to be prolonged grief. I'll be shocked that this has come out. People have been stuck indoors for 2 years and not been able to go to their basic communities. So how do we best support those people? It's recognizing that actually the kind of support that was given to kind of bereaved people previous to the pandemic, we actually have got to go back to the drawing board and actually have a look at that. It's very complicated, this grief. It's very complicated. And with that, there are now support groups that have been dedicated to this specific type of loss. Because we recognise that, you can't all... we all know what a unanimous feeling of grief is. But to have these designated spaces to acknowledge that. For example, I am a host of a bereavement support group under the charity The New Normal. And that charity group is the Black and Brown Good Grief, where we recognise that this space is needed on a cultural basis. There are support groups that are here for complicated grief, if you've lost a loved one by suicide, addiction, whatever you may deem as complicated. There needs to be specific groups, and they are there. And I think, suppose for me, what is kind of most, I say, frustrating, very loosely thing about how do we better support bereaved people, and kind of the saying there's being a lack of potentially. There's not. We're here. We've always been here. We're not going anywhere either as well. We've been here for a very long time. And it's only kind of just now that the light is being shone on us. In a way, grief is hot at the moment, in a strange, very way. And we've been here, but we can't carry that weight on our shoulders. And I'm beginning to slowly see the intersection between professional and non-professional sectors. I've been contacted by GPs and therapists, and they're advising and recommending not only my show, my community to people as an additional support. It doesn't have to be either or. They can work very, very beautifully coinciding to benefit bereaved people. I think we are definitely on I think there was an event on that was the silent epidemic of grief. I think we are absolutely on the brink of that. Think how many people we have lost in these 2 years. Think how many people have been affected by that. We're on the brink of an epidemic, and it's about time that everybody works together to better support these people. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amber. I'm not going to add anything after she's spoken so eloquently about your experiences. Does anyone want to just raise anything with Amber right now? She loves a question. All right, so we will move to our third speaker. Dan, over to you.
Gosh, that's a very difficult act to follow. When we were, and frankly, when we were planning this session, I was aware of what Stephen and Amber were going to speak about, and I sort of thought, gosh, what have I got to add here? And I'm relatively new into my research role, and my own research is in its embryonic phase, so I thought I might zoom out a little bit, and in the spirit of the Cambridge Festival, where the ivory tower of research meets the real world, I might try and just ask a few questions about how and why and what examples there are of bereavement research, just to try and sort of convince you that this is a worthwhile thing to be doing. First, why research bereavement? This is me sitting at home thinking, what would a pithy sentence be? So I'm very happy to be challenged on this. But what I came up with was to better understand the experiences and support needs of bereaved people and how services and society can best address these. And there are so many questions that we do not yet know the answer to well enough. So research can offer us solutions to all of these different questions, asking how many, how much, how often, who, where, how, what factors, why not, when, under what circumstances. And there are different ways of carrying out research to answer all of these different questions, however imperfectly. So I'm going to try and not geek out too much, but in basic terms, research into bereavement care doesn't actually differ that much from research into other more typical scientific areas. And the two sort of broad categories of research are quantitative, so numbers, counting, asking what factors, how many, what's the relationship between X and Y. And then qualitative, so this is asking the deeper questions about why and how, some of the theory behind the numbers. And then there are some very effective mixed method studies where, say, you would take a survey where that would be circulated amongst people, and they would respond with some tick box questions, ranking their experiences, whether things were positive, whether they were negative, how intensely things were felt, but then also some blank space questions where they would be able to use their own words to explain their experiences and their explanations for things, and then that can be analysed in a qualitative way. So there is a bit of a spectrum between the two, but they are the broad categories of research. I'm going to illustrate those with a few examples in a minute. The other self-evident fact is that bereavement is a massive topic, and there's no way that we could just simply set out to do a research study that would cover all aspects of bereavement in a comprehensive way. And for me, when I come into academia, I feel like a bit of a kid in a sweet shop, and I want to, I'm kind of interested in too many things. And Stephen's my boss, and I had a meeting with him earlier today, and he's playing this perennial role of saying simplify, less than that. So I'm learning gradually that we need to choose, and we can't choose all of these factors, but you can narrow down in many different ways. So we can ask about bereavement from various different perspectives. So a key perspective is, of course, that of the bereaved person, but we can also go to other people around them, so their family and friends, their healthcare professionals, other professionals who are involved in supporting them. We can also consider the effect at a service level, so not just at the individual providing care or support, but how we plan services, how we commission services, and we can look at different communities. Amber kept using that word community, and I love that phrase of different spheres of people who could be involved in supporting. And then we could be thinking about perspectives in terms of whether it's a high-income setting, a low-income setting, etc., etc. Then we could categorize by different modes or diagnoses, and it's worth acknowledging that the experience of someone who has been bereaved after their loved one or their person has died from a chronic terminal illness from a more expected trajectory is likely to differ from that of a sudden death, and differ again from the death as a result of violence or suicide. So specifying which of those we're looking at is going to be helpful, or perhaps drawing comparisons between different groups is going to be interesting. And then there'd be individual factors, so looking at how children grieve, how the elderly grieve, what the experiences of people who have lost spouses, looking at particular groups of individuals, so migrants, people who are not living within their normal own culture, prisoners, other vulnerable groups. And also thinking about a particularly interesting thing to me is that professional grief. So what does it look like to grieve as a professional who's experienced loss, particularly during times like our COVID pandemic that we've just been through? And then we might specifically narrow down on those who are at the top of that pyramid that Stephen described about complicated grief. And then in terms of focus, we may be wanting to know more about the background and experiences of people who've been bereaved. Or we might want to elucidate further the needs that they may experience. We may want to ask them about their preferences and what they think would be a good answer to the needs that they have. Finally, and where I'm more focusing, what interventions might work in order to try and improve support. So just to illustrate some, these are broad examples plucked just to demonstrate different ways that research is trying to improve bereavement care. So a couple of examples of studies that have specified and narrowed down on a particular time and space of COVID. So at the top there, support needs and barriers to accessing support. So this one is particularly looking at the needs of bereaved people during the pandemic. It used a survey design, just as I described, mixed methods, so some quantitative, some qualitative. So they were able to report interesting facts like the majority of people did not access formal support, and the majority of those who did access support did not manage to find it helpfully. But they also had some blank space questions where they were able to draw out some more narrative themes. And then this, I thought, was another really interesting example of a study which has used data that was already out there. They developed an algorithm to look at tweets that people had shared publicly on Twitter to try and draw out some lessons from that. So it doesn't even need to be going out and gathering new data, but using what's already there to try and generate themes and better understand the needs of people who've experienced bereavement. Another way of finding really interesting data is to look longitudinally, so taking the same cohort and asking similar questions of them at different phases. And I think that's particularly interesting in relation to a subject like bereavement, because it relates so heavily to one specific, very high valence event of the death of somebody. So asking questions of people perhaps before the event, immediately afterwards, soon afterwards, and then at longer periods of time afterwards enables effective comparisons and effective understanding about people's experience of grief over time. So one example of a study where it compared those who'd been bereaved by suicide versus those who'd been bereaved by sudden death, and looked at different points, again with a survey. And the bottom example where people had looked at the effect of caregiving, so whether someone had been a caregiver towards the end of life and whether that impacted them. The sort of gold standard in research is a randomized trial, and that's what you typically see in the new blockbuster cancer drug, where they've given one random group of patients a sugar pill and the other the new pill, and they try to demonstrate, controlling for all confounders, that this has been effective. That's a lot more tricky in a subject like bereavement care, but it has been tried, and there are ways that method has been adapted. So one example here is a cluster randomized trial. So you can't really blind to many bereavement care interventions, but what you can do is implement an intervention in certain patches. So certain GP practice had a training intervention, and certain ones didn't, and then they measured, rather than just looking at whether the GPs got better at delivering it, they actually looked at the outcomes. So they looked at the well-being scales of the patients who they were looking after, and they were able to draw conclusions about that. And another example about a particular type of cognitive therapy, where they used those who were on a waiting list for the therapy and compared it with those who were actually receiving the therapy. Qualitative research is, as I've said, asking those deeper questions about why, and that's often sitting down and conducting in-depth interviews with an initial structure, but you're able to go with the flow and follow the lead of the participant as a researcher to try and understand their deeper experiences, preferences, needs. And I've included an example here of where GPs were the subject, so healthcare professionals and their perspective. And then the bottom example is one where those who had been bereaved, so bereaved individuals themselves, were the subjects of the interviews. These are then transcribed, coded, and then analysed thematically to draw out common themes. And what we're absolutely not suggesting here is that you can come up with a universal theory of grief and bereavement that's going to apply to everybody. And it's a given that grief and bereavement is an intensely personal experience, but there are common themes. And there are things that those of us working professionally in this area would benefit from understanding. And just understanding the breadth of different ways that people respond is really helpful and really important. And then the last thing really, in terms of research methods, is synthesizing a number of studies. So this is taking lots of different people's published work and drawing it together, which provides a more powerful example and a more powerful argument for how to change policy and practice. This is a study that Stephen and colleagues who've predated me in the research group here have done, looking at bereavement care and complicated grief support in primary care using a realist review, so a particular lens to look at the research studies. And then the bottom example is looking specifically at bereavement groups and systematically going through the research, through the databases that exist online, and not only synthesizing the narrative findings, but also taking the numbers of each study and combining them into effectively one big study to give an even more powerful demonstration of whether these things work. And if you're interested as to whether they actually do work, then I invite you to look it up. You might be surprised. So people come into academia for lots of different reasons, and obviously we all come in with an element of personal interest. So I have what I'm particularly interested in, and I'm very fortunate to have been able to secure funding to work in the area that I'm working in, which I'll briefly touch on in a second. But there has been a whole community response to try and determine how research can improve from a practice perspective. So this was a study that engaged with practitioners rather than specifically academics in our ivory towers, to say what would be useful, what are the questions that you really want the answers to. And these were the sort of top headline themes that came out. So determining grief processes, so those are some of the models that Stephen touched on, giving some colour to those and expanding them. Are they really relevant still? Can we improve them? Developing grief measures, so how can we determine whether something is working or not? Improving grief interventions, obviously. Improving training and support. It's really well acknowledged that it's not just at medical student phase that people find bereavement care terrifying. There's many seasoned professionals that would relate to that as well. Understanding the needs of those with specific types of losses. So some of those groups I mentioned, spousal bereavement, losing a child, and particularly interesting to me, exploring social or community concerns, so the role of the community at large and non-professionals in how we can better support those who are grieving, and investigating non-death losses, so those who've moved on from a significant life phase through to things like even infertility. So my area that I'm particularly working on is community support, and this is just another way of illustrating the figures that Stephen mentioned earlier, that the vast majority of people actually don't need what we kind of immediately think of as the obvious form of bereavement support, i.e. that kind of counselling, psychotherapy thing. And there's been some really interesting research that's primarily come out of Australia that showed that actually it's the informal stuff that's people find it more helpful. So the highest level of perceived helpfulness was amongst those who were gaining support from friends and family and informal networks. And the highest perceived level of unhelpfulness was with the more formal support. But what's interested me is, what do we do for those people who don't have a good support network already? And what about those people who say, yeah, family and friends might be really helpful, but actually the people who are around me don't know what to say. They avoid me. And it's all very well and good that it might work well in the best scenario for some people, but communities need a bit of help, perhaps sometimes, to be able to respond effectively. And that's where I'm most interested. So just to wrap up what I'm currently working on, so I'm in a pre-doctoral research fellowship, so the hope is that I'll go on to do a PhD to build further in this area. But I'm trying to ask questions around what exists already in this space, and we're finding it's a really hard area to research because, frankly, it sort of interfaces with real life. This is just people meeting up with a friend for a coffee and getting support that way, and that's really hard to actually find evidence for. But I'm trying. So trying to work out what interventions exist already, what do we know about its effectiveness? Is it clinically effective? Does it improve outcomes? Is it cost effective? And then how, as GPs, can we be better signposting and interfacing with those services? And ultimately, how can these resources be better harnessed to improve our bereavement care at scale? Because every individual going for one-on-one bereavement counselling with a highly skilled volunteer or professional is not the answer. We know that already, but what is the answer? And in the future, I'm interested in looking at how we can increase the capacity of communities overall, and hopefully to move towards an intervention that might improve things. So that's me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. so many questions there for us to think about. At this point, can I open matters up to you guys out there in the seats and online? We'd love to hear your thoughts, agreements, vehement disagreements, professional insights, lived experiences. This isn't really about us telling you about our research. We're really kind of keen to have a conversation here. There's wonderful people who will bring you a microphone. So yes, the lady in the middle in the grey jumper.
Hello. It's more a comment of a possible omission than anything else, in that we talked about family, friends, and what have you. But in actual fact, in the workplace, I found that what was important through situations that I had was the support of the workplace in that sudden death of work colleagues. And although they weren't friends, I had probably spent more time with them, a third of my life, than I had with the current partner. And you were saying about counselling and not being able to afford it, and certainly those services provided through a workplace and a well-being environment and structure and programme in place, I know has made a huge difference to a number of colleagues in the organisation I work in. So.
Has that been anybody else's experience, or does that form part of your kind of areas to focus on in terms of communities?
I'm intrigued. What kind of services did they provide you?
Well, they had a well-being service. It wasn't for counselling.
Yeah.
For those directly affected. Well, it was available to everybody.
Yeah.
So anybody could access it who worked within the organisation. But also then subsequently, they, through the wellbeing programme, trained mental health first aiders
Yeah.
to try and spot just when there was a need.
That's really fantastic to hear, because there's some real horror stories out there of workplaces, even if the bereavement was outside of work or within work, of not being all that supportive. So it's really great to hear that you've had such a positive experience. I'm really pleased.
And it might open doors too, because it basically has to face up to pain and suffering at work. And I could think that might have, ripple effects in terms of other issues that arise in the workplace.
I think it's a really valuable observation as well, that you spend as much time with your work colleagues sometimes as some of your nearest and dearest, and that perhaps adds a layer of complexity to the way that you grieve. But yeah, for sure, I think in healthcare, I've certainly witnessed people who that sort of professional grief, but also personal grief with losing colleagues as well. It's a really important area, and thank you for highlighting it.
Yes. Hi.
Hi. I lost my mum a few years ago, not unusual for my age group, and then I had myself a cancer diagnosis last year with an excellent prognosis, and I cannot explain the amount of support I got with cancer was a log-fold better than with the bereavement. And that really struck me, because I had such good support, and particularly from friends, colleagues with cancer. Of course, the healthcare support was wonderful. So I wonder, is there something around that? It's invisible grief, and what Amber is saying, that you feel so isolated that in some cultures they wear different clothes, they might wear a black band or something, that people forget very quickly that you're bereaved. But I lost my hair. I look different with cancer. It's visible. It also made people uncomfortable. It wasn't like they were, totally, not everybody was comfortable with it, but people were much more likely to engage with me. And I don't know if it's because of the hope and the treatment options, whereas death is so final. And it really struck me. I'm also from Ireland, and the cultural difference, Ireland and the UK Republic, the island of Ireland have, very, very strong cultural links. But that was one time I felt really isolated in the UK, that people couldn't engage with death and talk to me in the way in Ireland it's easier. It's not perfect either, but death is something that people don't run away from. So just my
I think you hit the nail on the head there. You saying about how with the hope, with treatment and everything, is that people, could engage with you a bit more. They can say, oh, yeah, it's fine, we'll get to treatment, we'll be okay. Whereas when you say, my mum died, she's not coming back. Oh, what do I say now? It's the finality of it, and people are so painfully uncomfortable with it. And in the UK, we're not very good at it, very keep calm and carry on, whereas in Ireland, I can imagine it's very different. But I think, you hit the nail on the head and said exactly how I was going to say of that. I think, people having engaged with you, saying they've got the hope, they can look to the future and fix. We're so hell-bent on fixing, and with death, we can't fix it. So, fix, I can do this, I can do all this for you, I can help you, blah, blah, blah. But when you say, my mum's died and I feel like shit, what do you do now? Nothing. And people just can't sit in that silence of it. But thank you for sharing.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions, and then you lady in the blue scarf.
Hi. I was curious. The title said good grief, and I haven't heard very much about what good grief looks like. And I wonder whether actually one of the reasons why COVID and all of the narrative around that has been so shocking for people is that we don't talk about what a good end of life might look like, or a good death might look like, or a good grief might look like. And all of those conversations that really we've forgotten as a society, and medical professionals certainly seem to consider it as a sort of a help. And in fact, your research questions are very much, what can I do to help? What can I do to fix? What can I do? And actually, maybe those are the wrong questions. Maybe you should be thinking about what it is to have a good grief, or a good end of life, or a good death. And those would be actually more helpful in the long term for us as a society to be able to hold those things with us as part of our life, part of everyone's existence, rather than trying to think, how can I minimize it, get rid of it, make it disappear, solve it, and all of those things which seem to me might be where you're focusing, but maybe I've misunderstood.
Stephen.
Could I respond to that? I think you're absolutely spot on. That it's a profound issue in our culture and our society that medicine fixes things, and that end-of-life care and death and bereavement is something to be addressed and resolved. And it's not. It's part of life. And I think maybe part of the isolation of bereavement is you are an embodiment of something that we don't want to address as a society. But it's death and taxation, it comes to all of us. And there's some fundamental societal issues here of are we in denial as a society? And I think we are. And bereavement is a normal, intensely painful life experience, because it comes to all of us. Yeah.
Would any of the panel like to chip in with this?
I was going to ask, broad as you want, what does good grief look like to you? Being able to grieve good and well, what does that look like for you?
I think, as with anything that is good, it should be yours, just like a good birth might be very different for every mother. And we're starting to have those conversations about the beginning of life. And what I hope is that that can translate to the end of life as well. I don't think we're there. I think the natural birth movement and all of that has brought the multitude of ways to give birth into the forefront of many parts of society now. Sort of have those conversations. You can prepare and think about your birth, but I don't think death has got to that point. I think it's still intensely medicalized. I think it's still very ignored as a natural process. And I think that that's where we should be starting to have those conversations about what a good death could be. Will vary for everybody, but we should be having those conversations.
And giving people options. Absolutely.
Exactly, just in the same way that we're starting to give options about birth.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely.
And I think that the Denver Grief Wheel, that was one of the things they were trying to say, with the arrow being slightly above the horizontal, was that this can be an intensely painful process, but people can, if they're able to work through the intense pain, life looks very different.
Except
afterwards.
the Denver wheel didn't allow for other trajectories off the wheel. It assumed a cycle of very negative words. And it didn't, it assumed you may eventually come off that wheel, but maybe for other people, the wheel doesn't exist. It isn't
Yes,
a wheel.
that's fair.
It's something entirely different.
That's fair. That's fair. Hence, I use the dual process model as being a complementary. These are different ways of trying to understand. Yeah. Thank you.
One role that you might be interested in then is the category of, sometimes they call themselves soul midwives or death doulas, and that is a profession. There's some wonderful people working in the Cambridge area, and they explicitly are trying to do what you've suggested, which is align themselves with the support that you might provide to a mother giving birth, and to provide a different kind of care for the dying person and their family. There was a lady who had a question. Yes, 2 rows in front.
It was actually, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what that lady said. Basically, I think I was going to say the similar point about that it's a massive cultural shift that's needed, particularly with the medical profession. I mean, my husband died last year. He was terminally ill, and there couldn't have been better support for him throughout the end of his life. I mean, we had so much support, but the moment he died, that was it. Nobody asked me how I was. Nobody kind of, checked in. There is sort of support there within the community, but you have to find it. And it's quite complicated to find. I mean, researcher was saying that actually you can't find where it is. I mean, let alone, someone in a bereaved state. And so I think but it is a cultural thing about talking about death, because we just don't want to talk about it. And because the medical profession don't want to talk about it. Like, literally, no doctor would talk to, nobody wants to know the minute that you're dead. So, and again, of course, it's about resources. There's limited resources. So all of those resources go to the person who's ill, who's dying. And because we're ostensibly well, there are no resources. So, I mean, that was sort of, so it's just your point about the cultural change that's required.
We had a member of our lay representative group for the research group that described a very similar situation to you, and she described it like a double bereavement, that she lost her daughter to cancer, and she said that she lost her daughter, and at the same time she was grieving for all of the many health professionals that were around them as a family during that phase of illness, and then it all just went. So yeah, absolutely, I think you're very much not alone in experiencing that.
Super. Thank you. Yes, at the back.
Hi, it's not really a question, it's more I just want to share a perspective, if that's okay. So when I look at that question, how do we support bereaved people better? In my head, from my perspective, start in schools. I think there is a massive gap with how we learn about bereavement and death, and that it is part of life, just like you were saying yourself. I lost my mum when I was a child, and I generally feel I have grieved her more as an adult because I didn't get that support when I should have had that, because it just wasn't around. And I know that there is still a ball moving of all that, and there is some, but it's just there's a massive, massive gap still. And I think if it was spoke about more from a younger age, that we wouldn't have to have so many traumatized young adults as they get older as well. And that even if a child doesn't experience a bereavement as a child, that when they go into adulthood, it's almost like that preparing for something that could happen, and it does happen in life. It's part of life. So yeah, I just wanted to share that perspective. Also, ironically, I'm here with a group of young people that meet up monthly. We're called Let's Talk About Loss, and if it weren't for Amber, we wouldn't be here today. So just want to shout out to Amber there.
Thank you. And I love Let's Talk About Loss as well. I work for TNN Charity, but I support Let's Talk About Loss as well. I absolutely second you. I think back to, I would love to see grief education in schools and what that looks like. And my mum died, I was 19, so I'd left school just shy of a year. And as the years have gone by, I've thought, we used to have so many people come into the school and do, like, honestly, some of the most pointless presentations in assembly, and I thought, I remember none of them. But I used to sit there and I thought, I can imagine if there was somebody, say like myself, who had been an ex-student from there, who had done what I've done and created, come in and did a panel discussion and stood in front of, I was an all-girls school, and stood in front of all these girls and said, you know, one day, you know, some of you might be bereaved, probably not, but you will be one day. One of your best mate here, who won't be your best friend in 10 years probably, will be bereaved as well. You will all experience it. And these are places that you can go to, resources, just so you know, they probably go way over their head at the time and they'll go, whatever, like I did. But when they lose someone, they will tap into that memory. And I thought that would be so vital. But we, as a culture, again, I think we are so frightened to speak with children about death and dying and grief. But you look at other cultures and how it's just second nature. Yeah, your grandma died. And it's like, oh, okay. And they will be with the body. And I think back to when our mum died, and one of my cousins at the time, she was a bit younger, and she wasn't going to come to the funeral. Her aunt said, no. And my aunt said, no, she's not going to come to the funeral. I said, why? She said, she's going to come to the party after. I said, the party? I said, it's a wake. I was like, she should come to the funeral to know that the finality of it. She's not be scarred for life. She's not embalming her. She's not, she's just coming to the funeral. This is a way of life. And kind of now, like even with I'm not had children, but with my niece and nephew, they very much, mum died way before they were born, but they very much know who their grandmother is because we very much talk about her. And I think they're very death literate, they are now. They're nanny in the sky, stuff like that, We're so petrified of that we're going to scar children. And there's that whole analogy, isn't it, of children and puddles. They jump in, they go, why did my daddy die? And you're like, and then they go, can I have a bit of cake? In and out of it. And for you, it's so uncomfortable. I've had it with my nephew. He's asked questions and I've gone, And then he'll go, oh, can you put YouTube on? Like, just roll with it. They are more robust than you think. And so I would love to as well to see grief and education. Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you so much to everybody. I'm really conscious of time, but I hope that we've begun a conversation and that this can be followed up. You can Google Amber's podcasts, and she's got lots of wonderful resources there. We're tweeting using the CamFest hashtag. My website is Good Death Cambridge, and you can look up where Stephen and Dan work and the research they've done too. Talking and finding language before that immediate moment of loss surely has to be one of the ways forward. So thank you ever so much for coming along. I hope you've enjoyed this session and that you enjoy the rest of the festival. Thanks so much.
Thank you.